Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of our webinar series. My name is Mourgues. I am a consulting reservoir engineer here in Australia, and I'm also the founder of CrowdField, a digital hub for subsurface professionals. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Martin Blant from Imperial College London. He's in China, and the topic today is common misconceptions in the application of relative permeability and capillary pressure in reservoir engineering. I'm not going to read through the bio slide that I had prepared for Professor Martin Blant. Obviously, you know him if you're here, plenty of credentials. So I'm absolutely privileged to welcome Professor Blant with us and share his wisdom with all of us today. So just a bit of housekeeping, as I was saying before, guys, we have about 40 to 45 minutes for the talk and some 10 to 15 minutes Q&A at the end. Stay muted throughout the session. And if you have a question, just hit the hand icon at the bottom of the screen or simply type your question in the chat. But please stay muted to reduce the noise. Okay, Professor, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Alan, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present some of my ideas on relative permeability and capillary pressure and its application in reservoir engineering. So as Alan says, it's going to be about 40-45 minutes. It is deliberately supposed to be quite pedagogical in style, so please do feel free at the end to ask questions. So what's the outline? So what I have is 4 things we're going to work on, and then underneath where the common misconception is. So you'll know straight away what we're talking about. So I'm going to say a little bit about wettability and contact angle. And of course, that is one of the key determinants of both capillary pressure and relative permeability. And one of the key misconceptions we often have is that when gas is in the subsurface, it's always the most non-wetting phase. And I'm going to demonstrate how that is not correct. I'm then going to define the macroscopic properties, capillary pressure and relative permeability, and to show, yes, again, capillary pressure isn't non-wetting minus wetting, largely because, as we have introduced in point 1, wettability is quite a complex beast. And so you can't simplify things like this. You normally have a distribution of wettability, and you need another type of characterization. The other thing is not to assume that when you inject water that it's an imbibition process, which technically is only correct if water is the wetting phase. Then I'm going to talk about initial and irreducible saturations, which of course are used in reservoir engineering to initialize your saturation in the reservoir, and to show that the initial saturation you see in the reservoir is not some theoretical minimum, but something that is established in capillary gravity equilibrium. And then, okay, we've got wettability, we're injecting gas and or water, and we then drive the reservoir down to its residual saturation. However, the residual saturation is not the same as the saturation that might remain in the reservoir at the end of a displacement sequence, which determines recovery. So a low residual saturation does not mean good recovery necessarily. So those are the 4 things we're going to try and cover, save 10 minutes on each one. And I've already said what the common misconception is, and hopefully by the end of this session, you have some idea of why there is indeed some degree of subtlety and nuance with these concepts. So let's start with wettability, probably the most fundamental thing. And here is an illustration here. It's showing a flat solid surface, and it's showing water and oil in contact. And we define the contact angle, so this is a fundamental property at the microscopic scale, as the angle between the water and the oil as it contacts the solid surface. And of course, that's going to then affect the distribution of fluids within the pore space. Okay, now, how do we measure contact angle? In physical chemistry, we measure the contact angle through the denser phase, and that phase is normally water, right? Water is generally denser than oil, or if we have a gas, if we had a gas oil system, actually the contact angle we measure through the oil. If we have a gas water system, it's measured through the water, okay? Now, the main thing now to stress is not the categorization, you know, what is, you know, is it going to be water wet, neutrally wet, oil wet, or whatever? But actually the fact that in natural systems, you often see a range of contact angles. So we don't see a single contact angle, okay? We see different contact angles in different places. And why is that? Well, we may have a mineralogically complex rock, so they may actually have different solid materials with which the fluids interact differently. The second thing is that those solid surfaces may be contacted by surface active components. Now you might say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, the obvious one is you have an oil reservoir. Crude oil has been sitting there at high temperatures and pressures for geological time. That will then lead to a coating of oil. So where the oil has been, it's oily, it's oil wet. But you even see this in the shallow subsurface. You'll even see it in aquifers if you're looking at CO2 storage in an aquifer, wherever there is any organic material. So that's the first concept, wettability. It's defined by what's called a contact angle. We can have a wide range of contact angles within natural systems. We don't need to over-categorize it. Just be aware that that's the case. Now, there are a number of equations here, and I'm not going to derive the equations, but I'm going to talk now about the first misconception. And that first misconception is ducks don't get wet. So the equation that's written below there, and as I said, I'm not going to derive it, but for those of you who know the Young equation, there is a relationship between contact angle and interfacial tensions, both between two fluids and between the fluids and the solid. Okay, and it's basically just a force balance. If we have three phases, so this is three phases in equilibrium, there is a relationship between the interfacial tensions between the fluids, this is gas, water, oil, water, gas, oil, and the corresponding contact angles. And it's called the Bartel-Osterhoff relationship. But I don't want to, that's not really what I'm going to want to talk about. What I want to talk about is what it means physically. So let's look at it this way. I said that when you have crude oil in contact with a solid surface, often surface active components of the oil will adhere to the solid. So it makes an oily surface. So an example here, from my garden is actually a leaf, right? Leaves tend to be waxy on their surface, okay? So they're covered with an oil-like substance, right? Now, why is that consequential? Well, imagine we have gas injection for enhanced oil recovery. For those of you who are interested in carbon capture and storage, at the moment, the world is injecting something of the order of 45 megatons of CO2 into the subsurface that would otherwise go into the atmosphere. More than 90% of that is injected into oil fields, okay? So we've got oil, water, and gas all present. Now, what most people think is, well, that's easy. Let's take the water wet paradigm. So imagine we did have a rock that was water wet. What that means is it's wetting to water in the presence of oil. Now, when I inject gas, it is true, oil spreads on water. Gas is the non-wetting phase in the presence of oil. So gas is non-wetting to oil, that is correct. But it's also, of course, if it's water wet, non-wetting to water. So you have a water wet system, you say, well, this is obvious, water likes the surface. If I have oil or gas in the pore space, oil will be non-wetting or gas will be even more non-wetting. Okay, so that's the obvious case. That's the water wet case I've shown there. But now let's take an oily surface. So this is the illustration here. Okay, what I've done here is I've poured some olive oil on the leaf. And what's happened? It's oil on oil, it spreads out, it actually soaks into the dry leaf here. But what about a water droplet? I say, okay, well, it's an oily surface, right? I'm sitting here on a, laminated table and I've got some water with me. If I spill that water, the idea is the water forms a droplet. If I were to measure the contact angle through the water, it's greater than 90 degrees. That's what it means by forming a droplet. Well, we know that. Yes, of course. I laminate the surface. I've got a plastic surface. It's made out of oil so that it doesn't soak into the table and stain it. It will nicely brush off. The same is, ducks don't get wet. Ducks have feathers. That's a porous medium. If those are clean feathers, if they did to their feathers what we do to our hair and wash it with shampoo, it would soak up water and the ducks would drown and they die of hypothermia. But what they do is they fluff up their feathers with an oil gland, you know, or a duck. Well, I'm here in China, right? They cook a lot of duck, right? And I can tell you it's an oily meat. It's an oily bird, right? Those feathers are oil wet, but it's not just that they're oil wet. They repel water in the presence of air. So if we look at this, right, we can do the equations. The oil-water interfacial tension here in this equation is generally larger than the gas-oil equation. If it's oil wet, this cos theta is -1. So this theta is 180 degrees, so cos theta is -1. This is then a negative number. The cosine of the angle between gas and water measured through the water is negative, which means that the contact angle is greater than 90. This means that water is the non-wetting phase, okay, in the presence of gas. So now when I inject gas into the pore space, it is not the most non-wetting phase. In fact, the water is the most non-wetting phase, and that means the water is blocking the big pores and preventing the connected movement of the gas. And you might say, and if anyone's here as a petroleum engineer, you're going to be scratching your head. I've got a children's book which you read to a 4-year-old that explains why gas ducts don't get wet. So it's not an obscure or difficult or weird concept, but we can apply it, and we should apply it in the oil field. So let's explain what's going on here. So here is some experiments that we've done. This is X-ray imaging. So I'm using X-rays to look inside a piece of rock. This is a tiny piece of rock, okay? I'm not showing anything at the field scale yet. It's about 4 millimeters across. What's shown here is CO2 coming into the pore space. This is a reservoir rock, which is oil wet, and it's got oil and water in the pore space. So what I'm going to do now is play the video. Now, what are all the flashing colors? The colors show regions of CO2 that are completely surrounded by either oil and water. So they're not connected. And why are we seeing these flashing colors? It means that the CO2 is moving through the pore space. It's disconnected. Why is that? Because the CO2 moves in, water is blocking the big pores, so it pushes a blob of oil that might push a blob of water that might push another blob of CO2. As soon as I stop injecting, da-da, it's all trapped. So what this implies actually for CO2 storage is pretty good news, right? It's suggesting that when I inject CO2 into an oil field, certainly in the presence of mobile water, so I'm doing as a tertiary injection after water flooding, the CO2 is actually moving in a somewhat disconnected fashion. Its relative permeability as a consequence is really very low. However, every single empirical model that is used in reservoir engineering today assumes that gas is the non-wetting phase. It uses a gas rel perm that is measured just in the presence of mobile oil with irreducible water. And their gas is the most non-wetting phase. And yes, it moves through the biggest pores. And yes, it's connected. And yes, it has a high relative permeability. And you predict that a rapid breakthrough may be rather unfavorable performance. The reality is likely to be very different. So this is the first misconception, probably of all of them in today's session, the most nuanced, because unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer, right? Still very much work in progress. But for those of you who are studying CO2 injection with enhanced oil recovery, I would very strongly recommend that you actually make measurements of the CO2 relative permeability in the presence of mobile water. Okay, so next, sorry. So that's, as I said, that was misconception number 1. Okay, next one, capillary pressure. So macroscopically, so we're looking at this at the pore scale and we're looking at wettability. So now let's consider the macroscopic consequences of this. And this is the definition of capillary pressure as a function of saturation. And normally, yes, traditionally is plotted as a function of the denser phase saturation. So this would be water saturation in this case. So typical capillary pressure sequence is as follows. You start with a porous medium that's entirely saturated with water, okay? And then if we're looking at an oil field, this is primary oil migration. So this is the filling of the oil phase field. This is a primary drainage displacement And here we assume initially that the reservoir is indeed water wet. So oil is the non-wetting phase. This could also represent CO2 injection into an aquifer. CO2 is the non-wetting phase, water is wetting. Okay, so we've got contact angles less than 90 degrees. So this is your primary drainage. You continue primary drainage until you reach some maximum saturation, say your initial water saturation, okay? And now you're going to inject water, right? And this will either be the migration of CO2, of a CO2 plume in a storage aquifer, or it will be water flooding. The point here is, as we said, as, say, the oil is sitting in the pore space for geological time, the wettability will change. And so now you do not necessarily have a uniformly water wet, and actually not necessarily a uniformly oil wet surface either. What typically you see is what we call mixed wet behavior, where the capillary pressure has a region which is both positive and negative. Okay, now if you do this, you then can't define capillary pressure as non-wetting minus wetting, because now you're in a muddle. So how you define capillary pressure is, again, the pressure of the less dense phase minus the denser phase. So if this is oil and water, this is the oil pressure minus the water pressure. If it's gas oil, gas minus oil. If it's gas water, it's gas minus water. This is a positive capillary pressure. So what it represents is where water can enter the pore space at a lower pressure than the oil. So that's spontaneous imbibition. When the capillary pressure is negative, the water pressure has to be higher than the oil pressure in order to enter the pore space, and that's a forced injection. Okay, so typically this is what we see in terms of capillary pressure. We don't see capillary pressure as just wetting minus non-wetting with a contact angle, and it's either all positive or potentially all negative, and then you don't really know how to define it. You just define it as the pressure difference between two phases. You accept that it can have both positive and negative regions, and this is typically generically the type of behavior that you'd expect to see in the subsurface. The final thing here is often people describe the entire capillary pressure, and indeed the corresponding relative permeabilities, which we are getting to, don't worry, as being imbibition. No, imbibition in flow and porous media strictly refers to a spontaneous process. What I mean by that is the water will go into the porous medium without injecting, without it having to be at higher pressure than oil. And if the P1 is higher than P2, that means a negative capillary pressure. So imbibition only refers actually to this first part of the curve. Okay, so what does that mean in terms, as we said, of initial distribution in the reservoir, and then the difference between initial and residual saturations? In the laboratory, I can get a small piece of rock and I can inject oil, or indeed I can often do it with an analog non-wetting fluid like mercury into a vacuum. And of course, I got a small piece of rock, I can wait a long time, I can whack the pressure up as high as I like, and so I can force the water saturation down to a generally irreducible minimum value, right? And that is scientifically what I mean by that is within the pore space, the water is not connected at all. It will not flow any further. Now that's fine, okay? That's something you can measure in the laboratory. Nothing wrong with that. However, that's not what, of course, you're going to encounter in the field. So what you see as the initial distribution of fluid within a reservoir is here is the water saturation and here's height. And the point here is, it's obvious if you're a hydrologist, maybe less obvious as a petroleum engineer, but this is, basic sort of petrophysics, reservoir engineering analysis. You know that you will have a saturation height function because in equilibrium, capillary gravity equilibrium, when you first discover the field, we know that the capillary pressure is basically delta rho GH, where H is the height above the free water level, where by definition, the oil and water pressures are the same. Okay, so the height is just a rescale capillary pressure. Okay, so the shape of this distribution that we're showing here, this shape is identical to the shape of a primary drainage capillary pressure. So it's the same shape as in the previous slide. This is established by primary drainage because it's initial oil migration. So what you see here is you see a height at which oil is actually first connected through the pore space, because the oil starts off as the non-wetting phase. It needs a finite pressure, so a finite height to enter the pore space. And then you see a transition as the saturation changes. The point here, and particularly if we're looking at carbonate reservoirs or reservoirs with some very small pores, right, sub-micron pores, the capillary pressures necessary to enter some of that microporosity may be of order of megapascal. The height associated with that may be of order tens or even 100 meters. So if we've got a reservoir, particularly one without a particularly high or large oil column, say a reservoir where the oil column is 10, 20 meters, the anticipation, unless it's some multi-Darcy sand where all of this happens in a few centimeters, the anticipation will be that you do get a distribution of saturation with height. So your initial saturation in the reservoir, right, varies with height, and it will also vary with the capillary pressure and essentially the porosity and permeability of the rock, but it is not the irreducible, right, the minimum value. The other implication it has is that actually wettability frequently varies across the reservoir. So I'll give you two examples. Prudhoe Bay, which is the largest conventional producing oil reservoir in the United States off the north slope of Alaska. Ghawar, which is the world's largest oil field in Saudi Arabia, giant carbonate field. Both of these fields also see a wettability transition. And the reason for that is as follows. Near the oil-water contact, the water saturation is high, the capillary pressure is low. So actually most of the solid surface hasn't been contacted by oil. What's more, the oil pressure isn't that high relative to the water pressure, so the oil doesn't have sufficient pressure basically to collapse molecular films of water and actually physically at the molecular basis contact the solid surface. If we're at the top of the field, however, the capillary pressure is much higher, the saturation is lower, oil has contacted most of the solid surface and at a high pressure, so it's pushed, it's squeezed its way onto the surface. So there you tend to see more oil-wet characteristics. In between, you're seeing a mixture of wettability. Mixed wettability, actually like that generic capillary pressure curve I showed in the previous slide. So misconception number two is, the minimum water saturation that you may be able to obtain in a sample in the laboratory is not the saturation you're going to see in the field. That's controlled, obviously, by the capillary pressure height function. And furthermore, that may lead to a distribution of wettability within the reservoir. And that's particularly important because normally what you do in the lab, of course, you reduce the saturation down to its minimum connate or irreducible value here or close to it. And then you look at the water flood behavior and it's going to look like it's oil wet. And we're going to show, oh dear, that looks like it's bad for recovery. Whereas in the transition zone, where it's more mixed wet or water wet, the recovery can be a lot more favorable. Okay, so just recap before we move on to fluid flow and relative permeability. So drainage is the displacement of wetting phase by a non-wetting phase. Imbibition is the reverse. It's displacement of non-wetting phase by a wetting phase. We use the word primary because the porous medium is initially completely saturated with the displaced phase. So primary drainage, you start off being saturated with water. Secondary is when there is an initial saturation already present. So when we inject water into an oil reservoir, there is always water present. Okay, so that's always a secondary process. And then, that final point is, water injection is fine. That covers both the spontaneous and the forced, right? So if you have a piece of rock and you're pumping the water through, you are in the end imposing a negative capillary pressure. However, in general, imbibition is not the same as water injection. Right, fluid flow. So most of you, I think, are familiar probably with Darcy's law and its extension for multi-phase flow. But let's, show it, formally mathematically, so there's no confusion. So at the top is Darcy's law. This is the flow of a single phase through a porous medium, proportional to the pressure gradient, and this is the gravity term. This is the permeability, this is the viscosity. There's a minus sign here because flow goes from high to low pressure. Q, although it's called the Darcy velocity, is strictly not a velocity. It's actually the flow per unit area, per unit time. There is an empirical extension of these equations, and that's all it is really, just an empirical extension. This is for each phase P, okay, we have a Darcy-like law with the pressure gradient in each phase, the density of each phase, the viscosity of each phase, and here we have a prefactor here, which is called the relative permeability. This is traditionally written as a function of saturation. Again, normally the saturation of the denser phase, so water, okay? It clearly is a function of saturation because if the saturation is 1, say of water, then KRP is equal to 1 because it's single phase flow. If the saturation is irreducible or minimum value where there's no flow, then the relative permeability must be 0. And obviously, sort of rather logically speaking, you expect it to increase with saturation. Okay, so the relative permeability can be considered as a function of saturation, and it's less than 1 because what it does is it represents the fact that a phase is not occupying all of the pore space, so its flow is limited by the presence of the other phase. Okay. The only other thing mathematically that we see here is that we've introduced several phase pressures, but we know the difference between the phases that's given by the capillary pressure, which again can be written as a function of saturation. We've already shown that. So actually this is a complete description. If we know the capillary pressures, we know the relative permeability as a function of saturation, we actually have a description for multi-phase flow. We have a mathematical description, okay? There's a lot I can say about that, right? There's a lot of controversy in the sort of physics of flow in porous media literature, whether or not this is a complete description, but we're going to accept it for now. What we are going to look at is how basically the physics relates to relative permeability and what that might imply in terms of recovery. So I'm going to just illustrate a couple of cases here and particularly emphasize the difference between water wet and mixed wet systems. So what we have here, these are some literature values of relative permeability. So here is the relative permeability function of saturation. Most people find it necessary to label each of these curves. Hopefully that should be obvious that this is the water relative permeability because it's increasing with water saturation, and this is the oil relative permeability because it's decreasing, right? Because the oil saturation is going down. This is a water flood relative permeability. So the saturation is going from about 20%. That's the initial saturation. In this particular sandstone, there's quite a lot of clay, so it's basically clay-filled, low permeability regions, okay? And then we go here and we see that we leave behind a residual saturation of about 30%. Why is that? Well, in this case, it's a water-wet rock. Water likes the surface, oil does not. Oil tends to get trapped in the larger pore spaces. This is all well understood. There's nothing here it's necessarily controversial. We have some predictions here, and this is not the topic of today's seminar, using pore network modeling. That's basically a topological representation of the pore space and the sort of displacement processes based on fundamental physics, and that can predict the experiments. The experiments are actually three independent steady state measurements. So there are three measurements here. Now let's look at the relative permeability characteristics. The water, it's water wet. That means it likes the surface, it likes being in the corners and the small pores, but there's less flow. So the water relative permeability stays low. The oil relative permeability starts out high because it's occupying all the larger pores. It does drop because the water tends to disconnect the flow of oil. And of course, it drops to 0, normally quite sharply. Okay, quite a sharp drop here because now the oil has become trapped. All right, the maximum water relative permeability remains quite low. Why is that? Because the oil is blocking the big pores. Okay, now let's think about this in terms of recovery. Actually, a water wet system is quite straightforward. I inject water, and probably many of you know this. I'm going to inject water. I leave behind this residual saturation, so this 30% gets left behind. But basically, even in the field, if you've got a single layer, okay, you're producing oil, you're producing oil, you're producing oil. Now the water comes along. everything's trapped and your water cut rapidly rises to 1. Why is that? Well, you can see it from the relative permeability characteristics. When the saturation is in this range, there's virtually no flow of water compared to oil. So there's much more flow of oil than water for the same pressure gradient, okay? Basically, you only start producing more water when you're close to this crossover point, but this crossover point is very close to basically the residual saturation. So for a water wet case, in general, what you do is you start at the initial saturation, you get pretty close, right, to the maximum saturation, and you leave behind rapidly the residual. So if you've got a water wet rock, actually measuring the residual saturation gives you a good indicator of recovery, because basically that's what you're going to leave behind. So sometimes instead of doing this steady state, people do an unsteady state experiment. They'll just inject water. They'll see how much is trapped. That will give you some indication of recovery. Okay, but what happens now, and the emphasis for today is going to be looking at this mixed wettability, rather more complex wettability states than we normally think about. Okay, so here we have another measurement on a sandstone. This is Bentheimer sandstone. Actually, Bentheimer is almost pure quartz, so it's now used often as a benchmark. Okay, so here's for the water wet case. Look, the water relative permeability stays low. We have a residual now 40% almost. Okay, this residual, the maximum relative permeability is slightly less than 0.1, so very low. The oil relative permeability goes down sharply here. All of that is actually textbook water wet behavior. As I said, nothing controversial. Now, what happens when we have a mixture of wettability? Now, that's rather interesting. A mixture of wettability means that to begin with, you fill a few water wet regions, but actually the water relative permeability stays pretty low because you're filling some of the narrow water wet regions. You then start filling more of the oil wet regions, right, as you start, getting into the negative region of the capillary pressure. But actually what you tend to do is you're just filling pores with water from the water wet region. So you're sort of filling pores randomly in the pore space, but until those pores connect through their centers, the water connectivity and the water flow is really quite low. So what you see here is this rather interesting characteristics where the water relative permeability stays low and only increases near the endpoint. The residual saturation is lower. Okay, we can drive the oil down to a lower saturation because the oil as a wetting phase can be better connected in the end. Okay, but we see these very different characteristics. In this case, however, looking at the residual saturation of 11% is not a good indicator of recovery. Why? So if I did an unsteady state experiment and just got to this point, see here, the oil relative permeability at the end, here is the oil being displaced where it is the wetting phase. So it's a bit like water. It's clinging to the narrow nooks and crannies and narrow layers. It doesn't flow very readily. So the oil is flowing very slowly while water is now finally connected. What this means is I don't get to the residual in the reservoir because to do that, I'd need to inject 100 or 1,000 pore volumes. Well, in reservoir engineering, right, anyone who's done this, over 20 years, I might inject 1 pore volume of water, maybe 2. I'm not operating an oil field for a millennium, okay? It doesn't make any economic sense. So instead, the recovery is more between here and where the relative permeabilities cross. Actually, in this mixed wet case, it's pretty good. It's actually even better than the water wet case. So I'm not saying it's worse recovery, but I'm saying you can't use the residual as a guide for recovery. And that explains why sometimes there's a disconnect between the residual saturation that I measure in the lab, where I take a little piece of rock and I'm pumping and pumping and pumping. I pump thousands of pore volumes of water over many months, and I get down to a theoretical minimum where the oil is trapped. That cannot be replicated at the many kilometer scale. So let's have a look at some other results and other relative permeability characteristics and how to interpret them. So here is an example where indeed we do exactly that. So this is, again, X-ray imaging. So we're doing steady state flow experiments, but we're also managing to image the fluids within the pore space so we can really see what's going on. Okay, so here are the raw X-ray images. A fractional flow of 0 means I'm just injecting oil. then it's 85% oil, 15% water until I'm just injecting water. These are what's called segmented images. So the rock is white, the oil is red, and the water is blue. So you can just see visually, yeah, we start off with an initial water saturation that's quite low. I'm now injecting more and more water. And eventually, if I inject enough water, that's exactly what you can see, I can get to very favorable recoveries, okay? So why is that? Well, what's happening, these are pictures now of a zoom in of the rock with lots of different colors. I can't resolve the water in microporosity or in corners, okay? So I'm just looking at where the water is in some of the bigger pores. And what happens to begin with is it's filling some of the bigger pores at random through the pore space. Now, the water is connected and flowing, but only through microporosity. And that has a very low conductance, so the relative permeability is quite low. As I put more water into the system, okay, these blobs begin to merge, right? I'm filling more of the pore space, but the different colors show they're disconnected. There's no pathway across here, so it's still having to go through microporosity. So the real perm stays low until near the end. Now we're just beginning to connect, and right at the end, it's looking great. And the final relative permeability is quite high. So here are the relative permeability and capillary pressure characteristics. The capillary pressure is negative. There is a small positive region to begin with, okay, but now it's negative, but quite small and negative. You're actually getting quite a lot of displacement over quite a narrow pressure regime, okay, and then the relative permeability characteristics have this low water rel perm, but I'm not going to ever get to this true residual, but I'm going to get to a saturation around here, where close to where the relative permeabilities cross. So actually, this is a case overall that is quite favorable for recovery, but it's not quantified exactly by the residual saturation. So here, I'm just going to illustrate why this makes sense from a practical perspective. So here are some measurements, again, from fields in the Middle East, from Abu Dhabi. This is some work that was published 13 years ago now. And these are measured relative permeabilities on reservoir carbonates. And for those of you who know, in general, you'd expect reservoir carbonates in contact with the Middle Eastern oils tend to be either oil wet or mixed wet. There's quite a strong wettability change. So what we're seeing here, the solid lines are primary drainage. So we actually start from 100% water. We move down to the initial water saturation. The dashed lines are what happens during water flooding. And then the spots are what's called a bump flood, right? To get down to the true residual, right? You're just going to inject a lot of water at a high flow rate. Okay. What we show at the top is textbook stuff actually of an oil wet reservoir. So if instead of being mixed wet, it was oil wet, that's actually quite easy to understand. That's why I haven't said too much about it. It's oil wet, so the oil relative permeability will be lower than primary drainage, because in primary drainage, oil is non-wetting, goes through the big pores, high value. If it's wetting, goes through the little pores, low value. Water in primary drainage, the wetting phase, again, low rel perms, small pores. If it's non-wetting, so it's now preferentially just filling the big pores, okay? There's no spontaneous inhibition. You'd expect the relative permeability to be higher. So this is what you're seeing here, right? The oil relative permeability is lower, water relative permeability is higher. Sort of by construction, what that does is it moves this crossover to the left. So here, actually, this is not very good for recovery. Right? So this is classic oil wet behavior. You're not going to get beyond a saturation of about 50%. Yes, the true residual may be as low as 10%, but look at the oil relative permeability in this region. In fact, it's so low, it doesn't even show on the graph, right? It's effectively zero. Okay, so yes, in the lab, you can do it, but not in the field, right? So these would represent oil wet regions with relatively unfavorable recovery. And that again, is not controversial. On the other hand, the other 6 cases are a little bit more intriguing because, okay, the oil relative permeability sometimes could be lower, but notice the water relative permeability is also very low. And that's a characteristic of a mixed wet media, where the water is essentially held back in the pore space, is not well connected because it's filling a mixture of pores, both big and small. And what you see here is that the crossover point shifts to be about 65%. So this is a difference basically of 10 to 15% in local displacement efficiency. So we have about 1 trillion barrels of conventional oil on the planet, okay? Changes in wettability actually result in really quite significant changes in local displacement efficiency. And yes, you do see that mirrored at the large scale, even if it's all to do with well placement and heterogeneity, because wherever the water has gone, this is how much you're recovering. And the question is, well, we understand why. We think it's due to the full scale displacement mechanism. Can we design it? Can we try and, for instance, inject low salinity water, surfactants to move from the red to the green? Okay, so I'm getting near the end so that we have plenty of time for questions, okay? I'm going to plug my book and also a series of videos for those of you who are interested in learning more about the physics of multiphase flow and porous media and what they may mean in terms of recovery. But it is possible to do an analytical one-dimensional analysis to assess local displacement efficiency in a somewhat more rigorous basis, where you basically go from relative permeability, Adderco's viscosity ratio to predictions of recovery. So I'll just let you know that can be done. What I'm able to do in just a few minutes is a little bit hand waving. Okay, so I'm going to end there. Hopefully that's, should give us plenty of time for questions.
Fantastic, Professor Blanch. Thank you very much. It's always great to go back and revisit fundamental concepts. I also can endorse 100% your YouTube channel. It's absolutely fantastic resource. So for everyone who hasn't visited the YouTube channel, please do so. It's amazing. So I'm going to open up the room for questions. If you have one, just click on the little hand icon. I'm just going to kick this off myself, Professor, if you don't mind. Okay, I want to take you back to that primary drainage curve, and particularly focus in the zone between the free water level and the all-water contact. Now, by definition, capillary pressure obviously requires two fluids, and it's the difference in pressure between those two fluids across an interface. So how are we to think about capillary pressure in this zone where by definition you have just water? You have a positive capillary pressure above the free water level, but you have just the water in that region. So how are we to think about capillary pressure?
Okay, Alan, you have a good question now. So what I'm going to try and do, just to sort of mix things up a bit, I don't know if you can see my board behind me. So for those of you wondering what this was, actually, it's not the greatest pen either. Right, let's, okay, here. Okay, so we've got height and saturation, right? And it sort of does this, okay? And this delta rho GH is PC, right? So PC, so height is basically capillary pressure divided by delta rho GH. So how do you define it here? You can't, Alan, okay? The reality is, what you can do is you can have a repeat formation tester, right? So imagine right here, I can measure instead pressure, right? So imagine I'm measuring pressure as a function of height, okay? And what I do is I can measure pressure in the water here, and I can measure pressure in the oil here, okay? And what I do is I just look at the pressure difference between them. Okay, so if I do oil and water, right, so here we got if this is pressure and this is height, okay? So oil does this, okay? Water, you see at a lower height, right? And it does sort of this, okay? And what you do is you extrapolate the two, all right?
Yeah.
So you're extrapolating to the height at which theoretically you would see the two the same, and you call that the free water level. So Alan, you're right. Doesn't make any sense. How do you know what the capillary pressure is? Because you've only got one phase. But what you do is you measure the oil pressure with a repeat formation pressure in the oil column. You measure it in the water column, and then you just extrapolate those two curves.
And in that zone, sticking to that zone between the free water level and the all water contact, is water in that region mobile? I mean, if we put a probe there,
the water should be, the water, in terms of pore scale distribution of fluids, the water should be mobile,
So above the free water level all the way up is basically driven by relative permeability effects. There's no
Yes,
capillary bound.
The water well perm is essentially zero, right? So,
Yeah.
so you're absolutely right. Near the top of the field, you're going to get dry water production. Okay. Actually, what you find, funnily enough, particularly if you have this wettability transition, where it's mixed wet, if I showed you those graphs, actually the measured rel perms from Abu Dhabi, the water rel perm is essentially zero.
Yeah.
So even quite a high water saturation, you're still getting virtually dry oil being produced. Okay, so yes, near the top of the field, and actually where you're in a sort of mixed wet zone, you are producing dry oil. But if you were to complete your well in this region, there would be mobile water. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much for that. There is one hand up, Abdel Rahman, if I said that correctly. Take it away, mate.
Yes, hello everyone. I have a question regarding the production from the field. As I see from many fields, we are using the primary drainage curves in the initialization of water saturation. But with production, most of our fields, even they contain a weak aquifer, the saturation of oil decreases and the saturation of water increases with time. So that can mean natural or spontaneous imbibition. But we don't do that in our simulators. We just model that with the first drainage curves for the relative permeability and for the capillary pressure, and use it for the whole production. Even with production, the saturation of oil decreases and the saturation of water increases, and the water cut increases in our wells. So what I'm saying is correct, or I'm thinking in the wrong direction?
No, Abdurrahman, you are 100% correct. So yes, most reservoir simulations, what they do is they use primary drainage capillary pressure to initialize the water saturation. And I think actually that's correct. Actually, honestly, I don't think that's wrong. But of course, now you're water flooding, or you have a natural aquifer drive. And of course, the water saturation is increasing. The correct behavior will be to incorporate now a water flood capillary pressure, like I showed, right, in one of my previous slides, okay, combined with the relevant relative permeabilities. What most simulators do, because that's quite complex, because now you've ended up with two sets of capillary pressure, is they just ignore the capillary pressure term in the macroscopic flow equations. Okay, so it is an assumption. If you're looking at really field scale behavior, it's probably not the worst assumption in the world, actually, to be honest. Okay.
Yes.
But yes, you're right, it is an assumption. And one of the things you could investigate, if you're able to do this in your simulator, is say do a regional study, right? Because, it's going to be slow. Putting capillary pressure in your reservoir simulator actually slows the simulation down. So what you do is you do a regional study, okay? And you'd see maybe if I do incorporate a water flood capillary pressure, okay, how does that affect my results, and see if there's any sensitivity to that.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much.
Great. Jeff, good to see you here, mate. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks very much for the discussion here, Professor Blunt. It's all very interesting to me. And just on your early slide where you said you've got the CO2 storage aspect of this, CO2 injected into an oil field, depleted, presumably. But you're doing enhanced oil recovery. But for the CO2 injection into just a saline aquifer, do you have any sort of comments around the expected behavior, the migration-assisted storage aspect that you could sort of enlarge upon?
Yeah, sure, Jeff. I could have put that slide in, but in the interest of time, I'll also actually keep it in more reservoir engineering focus. The answer is, yeah, you get capillary trapping, right? Because in most of the saline aquifers we've looked at, the CO2 is in fact the non-wetting phase. It gets trapped in the larger pore spaces, and we can image this, and this isn't a surprise. I think that's well known. So yeah, I very much am of the opinion, actually my view of how to design safe CO2 storage in an aquifer is actually you have a large open aquifer. As long as you've got a good cat rock, as the CO2 migrates, okay, it gets trapped, right? Because it gets displaced by water. And that capillary trapping is a very effective mechanism. And the reason why you want a large open aquifer is it's much easier for pressure dissipation. So actually, my view is that for long-term storage, that is more secure than having a closed aquifer that people like because it's wrapped in low permeability rock, but where you have the risk of actually building up the pressure. And actually the CO2 stays mobile below the cat rock.
Yeah.
Yes, but no. The capillary trapping mechanism definitely, I think, is a significant player in cases where, if the CO2 is injected and just stays under a cat rock, which seems to be the generic, I like that case, okay, which is fine, okay, then okay. But if you have a case where the CO2 is migrating, I think there's going to be significant capillary trapping.
And I guess one of the risks is, well, a lot of gas fields, they would be fill to spill. And then you want to inject, and then waters come in if there's some aquifer there, as they've drained the gas field, but then you're going to start injecting a bunch of CO2 in, and so you can potentially
you're going to go below the spill point.
Spill, and then you don't necessarily have control over it if if you're not careful, I guess.
No, you're absolutely right.
Okay, cool. No, appreciate your comments.
Anybody else, guys? I don't see any other hands up. Doug, your turn.
Sorry, trying to find the unmute button. Could you just tell us, sorry, thanks for the talk, that was great. Could you just tell us, are there any differences with how methane would, say, coat grains and change the wettability as compared with oil? When we talk about changing it from water wet to mixed wet, we normally talk about oil. Is there any differences in terms of if it's a natural gas reservoir?
Okay, I mean, generally speaking, you'd expect that if you've got a natural gas reservoir with methane, right? Methane doesn't adhere to the solid surface, so it's not going to change the wettability. So most natural gas fields are water wet. That is not necessarily always the case. You can have some gas fields where there's bacterial activity, for instance. You can see bacterial activity in the presence of both methane and CO2, in which case there wouldn't be a strong wettability alteration, but there would be some. But no, in general, no, the assumption is in a natural gas field that wettability alteration is modest at best.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you very much.
Einar?
Yeah, okay. Einar Abeltoft, Equinor. I think you answered a bit the previous question. What took my attention on the outline was that gas can be wetting the water.
Yes.
Yes,
yeah, and
I explained it by the CO2 and three-phase situation, but any further comments? Because we have done reservoir conditions, water injection in gas reservoirs, steady state, unsteady state, and so on. And surprisingly often, we do see an end effect, meaning that it is, can we see gas wet?
Yeah.
Which is, to me, unexpected in most cases.
Okay, I mean, what I would say there, Einar,
is be lab artifacts, it's boundary conditions and things like that, but it is sort of the traditional drainage saturation profile. Any comments?
Yeah, well, I know what I would recommend. I mean, it's if you look at the equation, you see basically water being most non-wetting in basically a strongly oil wet system. So water is definitely non-wetting the presence of oil. So if you're doing an experiment with mobile water and you know that it's oil wet, you don't be surprised yet if you see gas wet type behavior. So what I would recommend you do is you don't dismiss those results, right?
Sure.
Capillary end effect is another subject for another webinar. But don't be taken by surprise and just dismiss it, because I think that is a genuine phenomenon.
Yeah, what I'm referring to is pure gas fields that haven't seen oil. So.
All right. Well, that
surprises me.
That is surprising. Yes, because it relates to the previous question.
Yeah.
I suspect that the rock is not quite as water wet as you might have thought.
Yeah. So no, it's more or less a comment. Yeah. Thank you. Brilliant. And
No,
I
no, thanks,
totally
Einar.
agree with most of your.
That's fascinating. If you want some further discussion of that, feel free to reach out to me by email, because I'm interested in collating, you know, scale type or field type information on this.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you for that. We have a couple more minutes, guys. Anyone else? Meanwhile, Professor, I'm going to ask again myself, if I take you back again to the saturation distribution at initial conditions, and there's a discussion that keeps coming up amongst petrophysicists and reservoir engineers, which is saturation height modeling versus J-function type of modeling, permeability dependence or not permeability dependence. So at a fundamental level, what is your thought in terms of permeability dependence on saturation distribution? Is it a direct correlation? Is there causality, or is it just indirect via porosity? What are your thoughts there?
Okay, I'm actually quite a fan of the Leverett J function, which is a sort of root phi over K scaling. I think I personally, I would use that as the default. The problem is that it's assuming that rocks of very different permeability and porosity essentially have the same pore size distribution. That is just scaled, right? So it's as though you're sort of shrinking or expanding the rock. Correct, because if you're you know, comparing, you're trying to have a you know, J function for a shale or clay versus a carbonate versus a sand, of course they're going to be different. However, I would use that as the default. I think if you don't put in any scaling with permeability and you're looking at a reservoir that may be orders of magnitude variation in permeability, that could be really quite misleading, because you definitely would anticipate much higher capillary pressures associated with the tighter rocks.
What do you say to the argument that the dependence on permeability is indirect via the porosity permeability relationship as opposed to direct?
Oh, you mean, okay, so you just look at the porosity and then you do a porosity permeability relationship and you put that in. Okay, that's clearly another level of approximation, isn't it? So it's not going to be great. So there I can see there is a concern. However, I still think trying to use the Leverett J function is correct. You should try and, I mean, you need an estimate of permeability anyway, right, in your reservoir model. So I think you must use a consistent characterization there.
Great, thanks for that. Nilesh, take it away.
Hi. Thank you, Professor Blunt, for your presentation. Very nice one. I have a couple of questions. Is this whether gas wetting a right term naming convention when we call oil wet or water wet, more oil wet, less oil wet, more water wet, less water wet? So can we include gas wetting in that naming convention as well?
Yeah, Nilesh, you have a very good comment here, and that's where it begins to get a bit more subtle. So yes, you're right. With oil water, we sort of have these different categorizations, and yeah, I'm not a fan of them, but you know, they're not misleading. The problem here with gas is actually the gas water contact angle is a function, right, of the interfacial tensions and the contact angles between gas and oil, which is typically 0 because oil spreads on water in most cases, and the oil water contact angle, which is exactly what you're characterizing here. You've got the Bartel-Osterhoff equation, which was that equation I showed. I know I didn't have time to derive it, but actually you should use that to quantify, right, the predicted contact angle rather than try and categorize. But in general, Nilesh, you would tend to see more gas wetting, or at least water being non-wetting. Actually, gas is always non-wetting to oil, but water being the most non-wetting phase in 2 circumstances. One, if it's strongly oil wet, which is sort of intuitively obvious because then water is strongly non-wetting in the presence of oil. The second is when you go to near miscible conditions, because then the oil and the gas properties are similar, right? So if it's oil wet, it's going to be gas wet.
Right, yeah. I have another general questions related to where are we heading towards, like relative permeability determination from pore network modeling and related simulations. Like I had attended some of the software seminar from some software companies, leading software companies. It tried to show some relative permeability models from pore network modeling and so on. They were quite sensitive to contact angle, and that too single contact angle values. But I also follow so many literatures there, like where we are heading to contact angle distribution rather than single contact angle values. So can you just explain a bit on this aspect, like whether it is right to use a single contact
Yeah,
angle value for the
that's
whole
one of the things I
just
try to
average
emphasize.
one?
Yeah, there is a distribution of contact angle. When we actually look inside rocks and we measure contact angle, we get a distribution, no less. So I think it's better to use a distribution. Unfortunately, that's very difficult to predict a priori. So if you have a quotes wet experiment, you can estimate that distribution. But in the absence of that, it's an input parameter into your model. And yes, the results will be sensitive to that contact angle. So my view of any modeling strategy to predict relative permeability is, yes, you can image the pore space, and you can do this at multiple scales, but wettability is a key uncertainty, and that needs to be addressed either by matching measurements, so what distribution of contact angle gives you the measurements, or by direct measurement on a wet image.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Blunt. Thank you. Thanks for the insight.
Well, with that, I want to thank Professor Martin Blunt. Thank you very much. That was an incredible presentation today for all of us. Thank you for carving time out of your busy schedule in China. And thank you everyone for joining in and the questions. You guys will receive an email in the coming days with a link to the recording. So stay tuned and we can continue the discussion on LinkedIn if you want.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and feel free to get in contact with me if you have any further questions. It's been a pleasure. So thanks, Alan. Thanks for everyone.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Professor. See you later. Cheers.
Bye.